with his thesis and my favorite title of the year, United States versus approximately 64,695 pounds of shark fins. Give him a hand.
On February 27, 2016, in the town of Muskogee, Oklahoma, Elwha, a 40-year-old man, is pulled over to the side of the road by a local law enforcement officer for a broken taillight. During the stop, the law enforcement officer searches Mr. Wah's car and finds $53,000 in cash. The officer then questions Wah for the next 6 hours and seizes the cash on the basis that it is drug money. However, Mr. Wah had never intended to use the money for drugs. The piles of cash in his car were donations raised by a Burmese Christian rock band on a 5-month tour to help a nonprofit Thai orphanage. In addition, the law enforcement officer did not have enough evidence to suspect that the money was to be used for drugs. During the search, there were no drugs, drug paraphernalia, nor any other evidence that could be used to justify the seizure of Mr. Wah's cash. A month later, Muscogee's district attorney, Lodge Orville, files a notice of forfeiture and seizure, stating that the funds will be used for public good. However, it fails to identify any reason behind the seizure of Mr. Wah's cash. After a long, difficult court case, the money is finally returned to Mr. Wah. Although Mr. Wah got his money back, the fact that law enforcement can seize property without an arrest should give us pause. This unfortunate truth, this lawful legal practice, goes by an innocent enough sounding name: civil forfeiture. Civil forfeiture is defined by the United States Department of Justice as a nationwide law enforcement initiative that removes the tools of crime from criminal organizations, deprives wrongdoers of the proceeds of crimes, recovers property that may be used to compensate the victims, and deters crime. In layman's terms, law enforcement seizes property in an effort to deter crime. In 1984, the Comprehensive Comb Control Act instated civil forfeiture in an attempt to prevent drug trafficking by confiscating property that was needed for the drug industry to function. Law enforcement targeted the drug industry through the seizure of 3 different types of property. These 3 different types of property will be categorized and visualized using a fictional man named Greg and his illegal activities. Now, let's say Greg buys marijuana to distribute across Texas and a car to take him from city to city. During his trip, he is pulled over by a local law enforcement officer who searches his car. If the law enforcement officer finds Greg's devil's lettuce, he can seize Greg's marijuana, Greg's car, and any property in Greg's car. The first type of property seized in this situation is contraband. This is property which is illegal to have in one's possession in the first place, in this case, Greg's marijuana. Second are facilitators. This is any property used in the trafficking of contraband. In this case, it would be Greg's car. And third are proceeds. This is any money made from the trafficking of drugs and any property you bought with the money made from drug trafficking. In this case, it would be any cash in Greg's car or anything Greg had bought with said cash during his trip. If Greg finds this unfair at all, he can challenge the civil forfeiture in court. Court cases for civil forfeiture are different from normal court cases, as the property itself is on trial for being part of a criminal activity. The owner of the property does not have to be convicted of a crime for civil asset forfeiture to take place. This is so that the property itself can be taken away, thus reducing the profitability of the crime. This has produced court cases with such amusing titles as United States versus Article, consisting of 50,000 cardboard boxes, each more or less containing 1 pair of clacker balls. If the seizure is not challenged, or if challenged the defendant loses, the property is auctioned off and the proceeds are given to law enforcement. Civil forfeiture laws can vary per state. Some states allow 100% of the proceeds to return to law enforcement, while other states require that a portion of the proceeds go to programs like education or drug substance abuse recovery organizations. Give me a second. Most states do not require the tracking of civil forfeiture, making state data hard to attain. Sometimes law enforcement can bypass state laws with a process called equitable sharing. They do this by linking seizures to federal investigations, thus superseding state laws. Civil forfeiture's use in America is widespread. Using available state data from 2001 to 2002, law enforcement on average seized from each state $8 million in currency alone. Bigger numbers can occur, like in the state of Texas, who in that same amount of time seized $22 million. This is quickly followed by Michigan, with a third of Texas' population size at $20 million. Cars are also commonly taken through civil asset forfeiture. In the state of Texas, over the course of 8 years, 11,000 cars were seized. In the state of Virginia, it was 7,000. At the federal level, from 2001 to 2003, it was reported that $1 billion was seized nationwide. The Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, a federal depository for federally forfeited funds, reports $1.9 billion in 2016 and $1.7 billion in 2017. This is enough money to buy 2 fresh-off-the-lot Corvettes for every single person in Circle C. Civil forfeiture was meant to be a streamlined system to effectively fight criminal activity. However, it has been turned into a powerful tool by law enforcement and is subject to great misuse. I propose to prohibit this through federal legislation, stating that none of the proceeds made through civil asset forfeiture return to law enforcement. The need to prevent law enforcement from receiving funds through civil asset forfeiture comes from its many faults. First, civil asset forfeiture is not a deterrent to drug-related crime and therefore should not be used extensively by law enforcement. Second, the monetary gain provided through civil asset forfeiture leads to its great misuse. Third, the laws protecting property owners and the regulations set forth by state governments is simply not enough to combat its widespread use. Does civil forfeiture work? All we have done so far is shown how often it is used and translated that into monetary amounts. Nothing yet has been stated on the effectiveness of the civil forfeiture program. This is because civil forfeiture has a negligible effect on drug-related crime. Civil forfeiture is used under the assumption that an increase in the monetary amounts seized should correlate to a decrease in drug-related arrests. Simply put, the more money taken, the less people are able to commit crimes with said money. I collected the data on monetary amounts seized in the state of Texas and drug-related arrests to show that civil asset forfeiture has a minimal effect on drug-related crime. The numbers show that assets seized increased by 231%, and drug-related arrests also increased by 33%. If civil forfeiture is a deterrent, as its proponents claim it to be, we should have seen a decrease or negligible increase in drug-related arrests. However, my study is not infallible, as I am not an expert in these fields. To understand more in depth the effects of civil asset forfeiture, we will look at a study conducted in 2018 by Mark Gaius, a professor of economics at Quinnipiac University, on the effectiveness of the civil forfeiture program. I chose Gaius' study to represent the effects of civil asset forfeiture, as it is the most recent study and builds on older studies that cover similar topics. Gaius mathematically denotes the relationship between assets seized and drug-related arrests with the following equation. Drug-related arrests equals assets seized plus control variables plus state effects plus year effects. Gaius denotes that the relationship between assets seized and drug-related arrests should be negative, as seizing more assets will raise the price of crime, thus reducing profitability and thus deterring crime. Gaius' findings show that there is a negative relationship between the per capita value of assets seized and drug-related arrests. However, this relationship is minimal and weak. For drug-related arrests to fall by 0.1%, law enforcement would have to seize $1 from every single person in America. This means if that law enforcement were to seize enough property to make drug-related arrests fall by 100%, they would have to seize $327 billion nationwide. Civil forfeiture's minimal effect on drug-related crime does not justify its use. Proponents for civil asset forfeiture have no basis for it being a deterrent. This is proven by Arizona State University, saying that not a single published study has linked forfeiture activity to the prevalence of criminal activity. This makes us question, if civil asset forfeiture has so little effect, why is it used so much? In short, the only practical reason behind civil asset forfeiture is for monetary gain. In Reeves County, a Texas county with less than 20,000 residents, local law enforcement was able to seize assets worth 15 times their annual budget simply because the county straddles 2 West Texas highways. Similarly, 11 Texas counties were interviewed who stated that the net collective spending on salaries and overtime using forfeiture funds was $20 million. They also reported $41 million on equipment costs, $6 million on facility costs, and a suspicious $4.5 million on miscellaneous fees. Harris County reports in 2016 receiving funds equaling about a fifth of their annual budget. For law enforcement to seize enough property to fill and exceed budgets, they use methods like traffic stops. The state of Texas reports 36,000 traffic stops that led to searches in the year 2016. On average, law enforcement will seize monetary amounts not exceeding $1,000. This prevents the seizure being challenged in court, as the cost of hiring a lawyer and going through the appropriate legal proceedings would outweigh the $1,000 amount itself. This is supported by Angela Beavers of Harris County, who states that only 4 to 5 of the 1,000 seizures last year actually went to court. This low number is explained by State Representative Harold Dern, who explains that most people don't know how to take on the courts without a lawyer, a luxury many can't afford. Excuse me a second. After law enforcement seizes property, there are two different ways that they can translate that property from assets into proceeds. The first is through state legislature. 26 states allow for 100% of the proceeds to return to law enforcement. 42 states allow at least 50% of the proceeds to return to law enforcement, and the remaining 8 states do not allow any of the proceeds to return to law enforcement. For reference, in the state of Texas, 70% is allowed to return to law enforcement. However, this can all be thrown to the wayside with equitable sharing, as it allows law enforcement to process proceeds at the federal level, thus superseding state laws. This increases, they also receive back 80% of the profits through equitable sharing. This increases civil forfeiture use, as it allows law enforcement to bypass state laws and any restrictions states might try to put on them. Excuse me. Such ease of access to funds, sometimes at the expense of your own property, should off-put you to some degree. The combination of great monetary gain provided through civil asset forfeiture and low legal hurdles allows for its great misuse. However, if the money incentive is removed from civil asset forfeiture, law enforcement will be less likely, will not be compelled to seize property in the pursuit of profit. The few, just excuse me for a second. The widespread use of civil asset forfeiture cannot be effectively fought in cases where the property owner is innocent as the laws are against them. In addition, standards of proof and burden of innocence are not sufficient to protect property owners from civil forfeiture's misuse. This is exemplified by the story of the Martinez family. John Martinez, an Albuquerque, New Mexico resident, has a problem with his 2006 Pontiac truck. The transmission is giving him problems, so he gives it to his daughter, Ashley Martinez, to take to her mechanic friend. Her mechanic friend, to get a feel for what's going wrong, takes the truck on a test drive down the highway. During the test drive, the truck is pulled over by local law enforcement, who, through some questioning, find out that Ashley's mechanic friend has a suspended driver's license due to DWI. They then seize the truck on the basis that it is related to a crime, even though John Martinez and his daughter have committed no criminal activity. Now the Martinez family sit around their dinner table, filling out the paperwork needed to oppose the seizure. The catch here is that there's no lawyer helping them, as the cost of hiring one would outweigh the worth of the truck itself. John Martinez and his wife, Cynthia Martinez, have to understand the complex legal jargon on their own, working hard to get back the truck they worked so hard for. This story is made worse by the fact that civil forfeiture has been banned in its entirety in the state of New Mexico. Despite this, the city of Albuquerque still has a forfeiture program in effect. They continue to seize cars until 2018, when an Albuquerque judge deems the laws unconstitutional. This would not have happened if the regulations surrounding civil asset forfeiture were sufficient to prevent such easy cash grabs. There are simply not enough laws protecting property owners and allowing them to challenge seizures. For law enforcement agencies to justify a seizure, they must produce a certain amount of evidence. This evidence can be ranked, and this is called a standard of proof. There are different levels to standards of proof, and we will discuss them from highest to lowest. The first is beyond a reasonable doubt. This is only used by 2 states for their civil forfeiture laws. Below this is clear and convincing. This is used by 13 states. Below that is preponderance of evidence. This is the most commonly used by 27 states and the same standard of proof needed by the federal government for equitable sharing. And at the very bottom is probable cause, which is used by 14 states. The commonality of low standards of proof in most states allows law enforcement to seize property and quickly run it through the system, converting assets into proceeds. However, the commonality of these seizures means that they can sometimes be challenged. If a property owner wishes to receive back their property, they must first prove that their property is innocent. This is called the burden of innocence. To prove that their property is innocent, they must prove themselves to be innocent. If they can do this, then the property is returned. However, this is hard to do, as it is easier to prove that the property is guilty than to prove that the property owner is innocent. While both of these things, standards of proof and burden of innocence, are checks against civil forfeiture's misuse, they are simply not as effective, as most states have a low standard of proof and the burden of innocence rests on the shoulders of the property owners. In only 6 states is there a high standard of proof and the burden of innocence rests on the shoulders of the government. This is contrary to most criminal cases, as the government has to prove whether the individual is guilty or not. This allows law enforcement to make a high frequency of seizures, as it is not up to them whether to prove if the property is guilty or not. This is made worse by equitable sharing, as equitable sharing allows law enforcement to process proceeds at the federal level, which is subject to a lower standard of proof, and the burden of innocence rests on the shoulders of the property owners. Equitable sharing's use is increasing each year. This is proven by the Institute of Justice. It is being used more commonly in states with a higher standard of proof and the burden of innocence resting on the shoulders of the government. The combination of both these things, low standards of proof and the burden of innocence resting on the shoulders of the property owners, allows law enforcement to quickly make seizures. However, if the money incentive is removed from civil asset forfeiture, law enforcement will be less likely to make large quantity of small amount seizures in pursuit of profit. Giving money to our law enforcement to better equip themselves is not necessarily a bad thing. However, when some agencies can receive millions of dollars, which for some is well above their annual budget, some warning lights start to appear. As it currently stands, there are few regulations on what law enforcement can spend the proceeds on. They can spend it on law enforcement, but that definition is flexible. This has led to misuses like a $14,000 training seminar in Hawaii, leather bomber jackets for the Colorado State Patrol, and a $90,000 Dodge Viper for the Dare car show. The problem of solving where the money goes is a difficult one, but legislation can mandate that the proceeds go to organizations like education or drug substance abuse recovery organizations, which is what some states already require. Attacking the illegal drug industry is not a bad thing, but however, when the methods we use to attack it are inefficient and sometimes harmful, we must take a step back and rethink them. Even if we prevent law enforcement from receiving profits through civil asset forfeiture, we can still attack the illegal drug industry in other ways. By sponsoring drug substance abuse recovery organizations and educating the generations to come, we can do more damage to the illegal drug industry than seizing a few $1,000s ever could. Thank you. Not the whole thing.
Couldn't do it, huh? I have another one here in case you need it. Returning for Alric's panel is Amber Compton. She graduated from Duke University and enjoyed a career in technology marketing and public relations before she left that industry to become manager of the Compton household, a position she's held since 2003. Returning, we also have Ryan Herring, who's been with the Austin Police Department for 21 years. He's currently a patrol sergeant in Southeast Austin. Ryan is a proud parent of a Veritas Grammar School student. We also have Alston Okpisz. You might recognize the name. Alric is standing before you. Alric Okpisz. And Alston was his advisor. He graduated a couple years ago and then sent his clone back to compete in the 2019 Veritas Senior Thesis competition. In this case, he is his brother's keeper.
I really think it's the other way around. I sent a clone out to do it for me.
So you know time travel as well? Is that cool? All right. I'm hip. All right. So Donaldson does not have brothers. He murdered them all to take kingship. So in front of you, you have a paddle. If you show me the white side, it means a new question. If you show me the red, it means a follow-up question. So the floor is open.
Good job. I seem to be dead. That's fine. Great job. Just first housekeeping question before we get into more serious questions. What was the reason why New Mexico stopped? There we go. What was the reason New Mexico gave for getting rid of civil forfeiture? Did they, when they got rid of it, did they? Well, yeah. What was their rationale behind it?
Do you mean the city of Albuquerque or just the state?
You said that Albuquerque wasn't doing it, but the state of New Mexico had abolished civil forfeiture. What was the reasons they gave the ones that you were giving in your presentation, or were they other ones?
I didn't look up the reasons behind New Mexico's banning of civil forfeiture because I was more interested in the fact that Albuquerque still had a forfeiture program while the whole state had banned it. So I don't think I can answer your question. I can go back later and check on that if you would like.
Question for you in the honorable representative from Houston that said the reason that people can't get their money back from court is because they can't afford an attorney. In your research, did you come across any research where people are saying, yeah, you know what, I didn't fight to get my money back because it actually was drug money, and I was guilty of what I was alleged?
There, from my research, there are cases where, as you said, the person who had their money seized did not challenge the seizure because it was drug money. This is proven by Timms versus Indiana, a very recent Supreme Court case where the individual had some sort of drug on him and it was taken, but along with that also was his truck. So he did admit guilty to having the money taken, but the fact that law enforcement also took the truck was too much, and so he challenged that. But there are cases where the individual will not challenge the seizure because they are guilty.
Austin.
So first off, congrats. Secondly, I noticed that in most of the data which you were citing, and you were listing Texas as a pretty big example of a state which seizes property and so on and so forth. Is that because we just like to do everything bigger in Texas, or are there other outlier states in addition to Texas which maybe not depending on the size have a unusually high amount of seizures?
Yes. Well, there are big numbers for the state of Texas because Texas is abnormally large, but there are other states which have seized almost as much as Texas. I mentioned earlier the state of Michigan with just a third of Texas population size seized nearly the same amount, which was $20 million in just currency. There was also the state of Virginia who seized like 7,000 cars over the course of 8 years, while Texas was 11,000.
So you mentioned the scale of beyond areas of doubt all the way down to, beyond a reasonable doubt, down to probable cause. Does
Standards
that
of proof.
scale happen once the things have already been seized, or does that happen at the moment of seizure? Is there any scale that an officer has to use when he pulls someone over?
As far as I know, the standards of proof apply in courts where the seizure is challenged. The law enforcement obviously has probable cause to search the car at the time of the seizure. So, I mean, that's at least the lowest level of standard of proof. I have not. Their standards of proof are more likely to be used in the courts rather than out on the streets.
Okay, follow up. And then, are you're advocating for the removal of all of this? Are you thinking maybe a baby steps process where first we put some reforms on how these things could be used, you know, how the assets could be used, and then maybe put some more regulation on how you can seize them, maybe use this scale of not just probable cause, but beyond a reasonable doubt at the moment of seizure? Are you saying go straight to no civil forfeiture?
I'm not saying no civil forfeiture entirely. Well, some people will argue that we should get rid of the system entirely. I still think there's at least some benefit to it. I only wish that the law enforcement do not receive any of the profits, as it will reduce the abuse of the system. Does that sufficiently answer your question? Okay.
To follow up with that, so why have law enforcement receive none of the profits? Why not have they're allowed to keep a percentage of their budget, or they are allowed to keep a hard number ceiling, like $1 million a year, and anything seized beyond that, so that you still have money going to the law enforcement agencies, but you do cut out sort of the potential to, or you cut out the incentive for maybe seizing beyond what they should be. Why no money to law enforcement?
Well, simply by the fact that they are still driven by an incentive for profit, even if we do put a cap ceiling on it, or if we say only a certain percent, they're still going to, even if they'll continue to seize property guided by profit in some degree until they hit the ceiling for the year, or the quarter, or whatever. I just wish to get rid of the incentive for profit from civil forfeiture entirely, so that any misuse of it just comes to a zero.
Follow up on that. What are your thoughts on talking about percentages of profit? And then you mentioned some cases where $1,000 is a threshold for certain agencies. What are your thoughts on let's say you have a car heading southbound to Mexico and there's $50,000+ seized from that car? What are your thoughts on having a minimum amount of seizure, or raising the minimum amount, so that if you just got paid and you're running down the street with $1,000, hey, you're safe in your $1,000, but you have such a large amount with no explanation tied to criminal enterprise? What are your thoughts on seizing that and then having that used to further a law enforcement mission?
So just a slight bit of clarification. You're saying there should be a minimal threshold on amount seized?
If there was, would that satisfy or put in an extra measure of protection to keep it from being abused if you're looking at really large seizures that most of us would never have an issue running into, of transporting $50,000 in our vehicle, cash?
So some of the reason behind the outrage from the people about civil forfeiture is because there are cases where some people are moving, let's say, their life savings from one state to the other. And for some reason or another, they're pulled over by law enforcement and their car is searched, and everything they have is now suddenly gone. Even if we put a minimum cap on the amount seized, that will reduce some of the misuse. But there are still cases where innocent people are going to get caught up in this system, and they're just not going to be able to get their money back. Does that answer?
So I've noticed that in the basis for why civil forfeiture exists in the first place, the 1984 Control Act, it was targeting, I presume, large cities to try and shut down drug trafficking in those areas. That was the original intent?
I'm not sure quite of the original intent. I know it was created around the time of the war on drugs, and it was just one of the systems created to effectively fight the war on drugs.
Okay, sorry, I didn't finish the question. That's not your fault. Did you have any studies or data which focused primarily on large cities where this would be more of a problem than more of a statewide study? Because I feel like large urban areas would be the main targets of that legislation. Do you have any studies which are just focusing on those?
Unfortunately, there are no studies just focusing on those, as there just generally are not that many studies on civil forfeiture in the first place. But kind of counter to what you would actually think, civil forfeiture is not really heavily applied in the cities. It's more heavily applied out in the boonies of Texas. I mentioned Reeves County, a Texas county with like less than 20,000 residents. They got a lot of money because they were on 2 West Texas highways, and they could just simply pull over a lot of people. I also talked to a law enforcement officer who was stationed here, and he said a lot of the abuse just ends up in the countryside. It's not as much of a problem in the city of Austin. It's just the smaller departments are using it to sometimes fill budgets and their gaps that their annual budget doesn't cover, and they just use the system to cover needs or whatever they use the expenses for.
You mentioned 2 highways in Texas, and then also I-35 being one of them. Is there anything else that may be occurring on those highways in those small towns or outlying areas that would lead to such seizures? Or is it just the highway, or does those highways go anywhere particular that might have an increase of activity where the seizures might be relevant?
So you're asking if it's more likely to be used on highways rather than, let's say, towns?
For instance, I-10 is a major drug corridor in Texas, so is I-35, so is I-45, and that runs through small towns. So is it being abused, or is it just that those officers are maybe devoting some more time, or maybe have more time, to look at that kind of activity and then seize more money as a result of the drug trafficking that's going on?
I believe the law enforcement in those smaller states are abusing it because while those highways are important to the drug industries and getting lots of drugs into the state of Texas and out and about across the United States, law enforcement is just seizing way too much property. They're receiving back millions of dollars, and it's simply too much. While it makes sense that they would be seizing higher amounts, I just believe that the amounts that are reported are too high. Oh, I don't have water.
So can you give me some justification so why is the stuff decoupled from the individual? So you have court cases of state versus like clacker balls.
Or shark fins.
Or shark
my
fins.
favorite.
Yeah, so what is the protection, or what is the rationale for having it be its own, that it's decoupled from a specific incident?
So the rationale behind actually putting the property itself on trial is that the property, putting a person in jail will not deter drug crime from happening. You can put a bunch of people in the drug industry in jail, and they'll just wait out their time and then get right back out and continue working. If you take, however, the property itself away, like a plane or a truck, they can't really fix that as much. They have to go buy a new truck, or they have to go buy a new plane. And if the rationale is that you seize enough of that, that just hikes up the price so much to distribute out drugs, it just simply becomes not profitable for them to continue working in the business. So the property being decoupled from the owner allows it so that the property can just be taken away just like that. Run it through the trial, prove it is guilty, and then it's on its way to be turned into assets, or turned into proceeds.
And then just to follow up on that, is any research or proposals you're looking? It seems like a lot of this, the heart behind it is tied behind the drug industry, or to be tied, not drug industry, the illegal drugs. But a lot of the stories that you gave of where it went wrong is like that family who got caught up because their mechanic had a suspended license. So did you do any research or see anybody proposing that civil forfeiture should only apply when the probable cause has to do with drugs as opposed to other kinds of criminal behavior?
Yes. I did find a study where it was on how, let's see if I can get these words exact. It was civil forfeiture is being grossly misused for other purposes than drug-related crime. Just over time, it has been expanded to cover a wide range of crime, allowing law enforcement to seize more property related to different crimes. Was that sufficient, or did you?
And then do you have speculation that having it just tied to probable cause related to drug trafficking or illegal drug activity, do you think we could keep civil forfeiture with its sort of intended purpose against the drug industry, against illegal drugs versus these other things, or can those not be easily separated?
I think they can be easily separated, as it was originally just used for drug-related crime, and then over time it expanded to cover more crime. So I think we can easily separate it out so that only drug-related crime is linked with civil forfeiture activity.
One of the things you talked about was getting the money back and also using it for other purposes. With a person that's arrested, they get out on bail, and their body becomes their guarantee, or the money they put down is a guarantee. They'll come back, their body will show up, and they go to court. With property, what guidelines would you put in place where if you take my $10,000 and you say, okay, I'm out of jail, here's your $10,000 back, you have to come back, but how do you guarantee that I'm going to bring my $10,000 back available for a trial, or my plane or my boat or whatever that's seized under shady circumstances, me doing shady things? How do you guarantee that back? Because the only way to truly get the body from not coming back is you run or you die. But the plane can be sold off or whatever. So what are your thoughts on that?
Unfortunately, right now there is no insured way that the property will be there if you need to, like let's say they seize something from you and it's not related to drug-related activity. There is no guarantee that your property will be there 6 weeks from then. I talked to a law enforcement officer who was here, and he stated that the system really needs to be fixed long-term, because sometimes law enforcement can seize really nice cars, and then 5 weeks later, they are using it for law enforcement use. So just currently right now, there is no guarantee that long-term your property will be there if you can come back and challenge it.
This speaks to specific deterrence, general deterrence. You talked about studies that said basically one viewpoint is that law enforcement's not seizing enough to make a dent in the drug trade. So, if you get punished, that's for you to stop doing it, but also one theory is for someone else to go, ooh, he got punished, I don't want to do that, right? So when it comes to other crimes, and one of the areas that's being looked at to seize cars is under DWI or DUI. Is there a point where, that's the instrument by which this crime is being committed, is there a threshold the first time, second time, third time, fourth time on up to where you would be okay with, hey, you know what, that is the manner by which you're committing this crime and you've been found guilty of it? Is there a manner or a threshold that you would be okay with, you know what, that's enough. We're going to take your ability away to be able to drive at least your own vehicle.
I'm slightly confused by the question.
Would you be okay with, after someone's been found guilty of DWI, let's say 2-3 times, would you be okay with that vehicle being seized because that is the manner in which that crime is being committed, and it would be through civil forfeiture? Would you be okay with that, and what do you do with that car if it doesn't go to law enforcement? What do you do with it?
I am absolutely fine if after, let's say, Charles' third time driving around drunk, they seize his car, because they have proof that this is a repeated offense, and they can only assume that he's going to keep doing it again if he's already done it this many times in the past. And so that truck can be run through civil forfeiture and turned into proceeds. My problem is just when law enforcement gets it back. We can simply solve that with banning law enforcement from receiving back the proceeds, and it goes to, let's say, a program educating people on why driving drunk is bad, or just raising more awareness for the problem. It can be used simply like that to, I hope, prevent more accidents like that, rather than just given to law enforcement who might do that thing with, not do that thing, but arrest more people and take their property, and they haven't honestly educated the people on why you should not be driving drunk.
Alric? Alston?
I'm here.
Doggone it.
I'll ask myself.
I thought you said all right to
You send
conclude it.
clones and then you guys get me in trouble for messing up the names. I see how it is.
You mentioned that there were 2 checks on civil forfeiture in your third confirm audio: standards of proof and burden of evidence. I
Innocence.
understand how standards of proof, because they vary by state, the level. I can understand how that it sounds fair enough to me. The part which really confused me was burden of evidence. How did burden of evidence go from the government's requirement to prove that they are guilty to being the owner proving that the property is innocent? Why was there that flip? Do you know of any historical reason for that?
No, I don't. In my research, I didn't specifically look up why that happened. That was something I saw and saw that it was a problem. I did not look up the historical reasons behind that.
All right. Thank you, Ulrich.
Oh, it's 20 minutes.
All right, that concludes.